Fine. Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Jan Mehana. I'm the Senior Manager of Al Arts Foundation, and I'm very happy to introduce today's program, which is one of our residence programs, public programs with Mhamad Safa. So Mhamad is a very good friend, an artist, a musician, and researcher whose work focuses on sonic matters. He graduated from Goldsmith, from the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmith, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Westminster. And so we also want to thank Lawrence Abu Hamdan, who stepped in and is joining us tonight for a conversation with Mhamad. Lawrence is part of the Al Arts Foundation team, almost part of the team. His studio is actually based here in our space. He's a private ear. He received a PhD in 2017 from Goldsmith and was awarded the Turner Prize in 2019. And he's also a member of the selection committee who is involved in the residency and research grant selection. So I will not be very long. I'll just say that it will be a presentation followed by a discussion and then a Q&A with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, okay, can you hear me? That's good. Okay, thank you, Diane, and thank you to Al Circal Arts Foundation, everyone at Al Circal for the support in these last 2 months and all the great work that has been happening. And thanks a lot to Lawrence for taking part of this. What will happen now is that I will show like a brief part. This is not a work in progress, actually. This is a very much summarized part of a way larger, bigger, or like way bigger work. And this is a section of it. Even this section can be like bigger, but just for several considerations, it's a bit compact. And then it will be followed by a conversation on topics that we will see here with Lawrence. Okay. In an open courtyard, overcrowded with immersed listeners and instrumentalists, consecutive and polyrhythmic percussive patterns enthralled the congregation of devout young men, overlaid by distorted and middle-pitched chanting of the infamous Saudi crooner Shabah Bisha. A sonorous yet oddly synced musical atmosphere rocks the neighboring buildings. The assembly is gradually structured according to engagement and role in the ritual. A rhythmically swaying group stands by the fence of the courtyard behind the large speaker system and adjacent to the percussionists. A further layer of seated and observing crowd forms an internal square. As this may appear like a traditional Saamiri ceremony in Saudi Arabia, the engagement with Bija's voice and his accompanying percussion would be an understatement for one or more listeners. Inside the inner square, known as Maidan al-Raqs, the seated audience is dazed by a spectacle of exhilaration, entranced with the syncopated musical meters. A young man is zealously dancing in the middle of the Maidan. His affectations abruptly shift as the progressive banging drums decrease in intensity. It seems as if a swelling, a certain upsurge, was on its way to a state of jouissance. And as the sonic triggers discontinue, physical mannerisms of pain, exhaustion, and anxiety become visible. Staggeringly, next to him, an enchanted listener gradually goes into a catatonic state, while another member of the audience attempts to ease his manifestations. These symptoms of an otherworldly event convey the impression of an extraordinary presence. Nevertheless, Countless matching gestures and conditions appear the more one tracks down Shabah Bisha's performances, as well as other assemblies of Saamiri. Quoting this with a rationalized and scientific observation misperceives this practice's cultural, political, and epistemological significance. It is known as Istinzal, as the title of the inspected video suggests. This condition occurs when some members of Saamiri's audience go into a state of trance following an intensification of particular drumming patterns. Spirit possession, as a performed ceremony, is a method to rethink and reconfigure the mechanisms and Western scientific discourses around both trauma and its acoustic causalities. As a site of contestation, the evolution of trauma discourse is entrenched in a techno-scientific canon and the socially constructed mode of representation. It alienates any engagement with the social peculiarities, sensibilities, and geographic contingencies of the Global South. As areas struck the most by man-made and natural calamities, these geographies are often a container of traumas, with causalities and manifestations unconventional to psychiatric institutions. These causalities include racialization, marginalization, dispossession, displacement, land grab, environmental toxicity, and the aftermath of colonialism overall. These are the consequences of accelerated capitalist modes of production and its ensuing forms of neocolonial violence. The examination of the ritual structure and its otherworldly symptoms includes the denotation of patterns, repetition, entrainments, abruptions, and manifestations. However, this analysis moves away from parallels between the pathologies of post-traumatic stress and the ones of spirit possession rituals. But rather, it links these rituals to the performatic nature of trauma, as Diana Taylor calls it, and its performative acts of measurement, as Karen Barad and Judith Butler coined this term. These two registers are materialized through extra-linguistic indicators, such as the bodily, musical, or extra-physical. These signs potentially negotiate with issues of accessing traumatic events where language fails. This performative and oral practice attempts to unearth an experience that surpasses modes of representation, namely language. And as philosopher Giorgio Agamben reveals while reflecting on Primo Levi's account of Auschwitz, quote, "What cannot be stated, what cannot be archived, is the language in which the author succeeds in bearing witness to his incapacity to speak. And this language that survives the subjects who spoke it coincides with a speaker who remains beyond it." End of quote. So, while this examined ritual occurred sometimes around 2018, almost 140 years separated from the moment the disciples of the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot subjected so-called hysteric women to the sound of Chinese gongs and tuning forks. And through these experiments at the Salpêtrière Hospital, one of his disciples, Paul Rignard, attempted to demystify and rationalize what was previously thought to be in the realm of sorcery. These gruesome experiments were intended to verify whether hysteria was a legitimate disease of neurological nature. And by inducing sonic shocks, Charcot and his protégé were one of the earliest scientists to delve into the causalities of trauma before it was labeled as such. The documented images, however, were used as evidence. And the evidence was in the form of bodily gesticulations, symptoms of arousal and excitement, sudden contraction, and hand gestures, or a performance of the malady overall. Between both eras of the Salpêtrière and the Saamiri ritual, scientific methods of quantifying sound and its effects on humans had sought to reach the most objective forms of evidence. Between those two moments in history, technologies of visualizing, mapping, and metricizing the sonic and its extraoral or psychosocial effects had moved from observational methods and relied on numerical and graphic verifications. This was a shift from discerning bodily responses to what Marina Peterson calls a visceral inscription. A return to the performative and observational, in this case, reevaluates the ways in which sounding, listening, and their effects are rendered visible. Possession is a phenomenon whose causal forces and symptoms occur within a semi-controlled environment. Unlike the working of contemporary clinics, both causes and effects of spirit possession can materialize within the same location. Although resulting from a fusion of geographic roots, the occult ancestries of Saamiri are intertwined with Zar practice and spirit possession. Both practices, sometimes with the same connotations in some cultures in the Arabian Peninsula, initially serve to expel or appease an entity residing within an afflicted person. Saamiri's musicological origins are of Bedouin descent. However, its occult undertones, namely Zar, were integrated into Saamiri's practice. Indebted to the African presence, through slave trade, commercial exchange with the East African coast, the possession ritual became an integral part of the private performance of Saamiri. Nevertheless, official and documented narratives on the spiritual peculiarities of Saamiri and Istinzal are scarce, but its influences from Zar provide further details on the ritual structure. Essentially, these rituals are cultural practices whose role is very specific. The interaction between the world of the human, known as ins, and one of the spirit, known as jinns, is in constant flux in Zar. Not so far from traditional Islamic principles, the spirits, whether benign or nefarious ones, have the power to infiltrate human bodies and dominate consciousness. This process of possession connects to several misgivings and adverse but also fortunate events that might strike an individual. It is theorized that in Zar's geographies, psychological tremors and symptoms of unexplainable nature are surfaced, diagnosed, and healed. Nevertheless, these psychological logics are foreign to Zar rituals and are only analytical tools that inscribe and rationalize this phenomenon to a Western readership. These tensions between the psychotherapeutic and the spiritually remedial describe a scientific endeavor to pathologize and categorize indigenous experiences and practices. Existing in more recent research on the manifestation of Zar attempt to locate their intersection with personality disorders. And indeed, some parallels arise between spirit possession, symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, and post-traumatic stress and post-conflict geographies. While such observations advance nothing other than a continuum of neo-colonial logic that applies as dispositif to make sense of the other, parallels between spirit possession and psychopathologies are crucial for this critique. It exposes where psychiatric documents, such as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorder, fail. Inside this document, known as the DSM, in its 4th version, culture-bound syndrome summarizes this enigma. It is a syndrome that is included in this psychiatric document. Spirit possession and its symptoms do not follow a logic that is as linear as a Western psychiatric one. Azar healing is not the occult mirror of its psychiatric counterpart. A spirit seizing an individual does not necessarily leave the body, but rather it goes through the process of sulha, meaning reconciliation. Zar, as such, is not a straightforward healing institution, but rather its cathartic aspects of collective affect arise from within the social dynamics that define it. In that sense, communicating with and conjuring Zar spirits is a communal practice of care within cults and religious groups. Although the nature of the spirits is known to veteran Zar masters, illnesses or pathologies are sensed through percussive rituals, among other musical and non-musical ceremonies. The sonic and performative registers are crucial. After suspecting symptoms of possession, a subject attends a hadra, meaning the presence, which is the public Zar ceremony. During these hadras, rhythmic rituals occur repetitively to test the responses of the afflicted subjects. However, contrary to popular belief, the rhythmic structure, its frequencies or intensity levels are not a singular, extraordinary sonic phenomena that induces trance. The hadras, like Saamiri, are an entangled social, spatial, and ontological condition through which atmospheres of devotional listening emerge. It is assembled through the congregation of devout practitioners, the spatial configuration of the rituals, the objects and instruments used in the ceremony, such as incense or offerings, the multiple iterations that constitute the hadra known as tazkira or the reminder, as well as the social construct that underlie this practice overall. Hence, the percussive sonorities will only exert their desired effects when performed within this atmosphere. It acts as an amplifier, a sonic conductor through which repetitive rhythms are capable of reaching ears and psychosocial constructs. As Hagar al-Hadidi puts it, this atmosphere provides a scaffolding within which the flexible structure of the Zar ritual materializes, and its malleability is paralleled in the musical and rhythmic styles themselves. Since Zar had multiple manifestations and materializations and several geographies, percussive rituals adapt to these morphing localities. When rhythm traveled from the East African coast to the Arabian Peninsula, they historically adapted to the Bedouin musical cultures. They also evolved along with modern audio technologies and electronic instruments. The spirit possession or practice of Istinzal does not necessarily occur anymore within pseudo-vernacular context, but mostly within contemporary spatial configurations. In these settings, the domestic, the cloaked, and or the prohibited practices sometimes bleed into the social in its spatial sense. Hence, technologies of amplification become vital for modern rituals, such as loudspeaker systems, bigger and more numerous drumming ensembles, microphones, and sometimes electrical keyboards. These techniques of intensification and loudness reorganize the influence of the sonic phenomena on the psychosocial. Sound in the ritual is instrumentalized as a diagnostic technology through which individual and historic accounts are unmasked. Memories of personal suffering and stressful encounters emanating as repetition occupy the maximum range of audibility. But also, through this collision between a transborder practice with a localized culture, narratives of displacement, forced migration, and to a greater extent slavery are all excessive undertones that surface under the form of a quasi-psychic manifestation. Thank you. Okay, thanks. I want to invite Lawrence to have a conversation, and before we start, oh, thank you. Before we start, yeah, again, thank you, Lawrence, and just want to say that we've been in conversation before, and particularly on several topics that relate to this project, but as well that that have a certain kind of communication directly as well with your work. So, and what mostly is interesting is when you, with your work, when you think about the sonic image, or I don't know if you call it an acoustic image or the sonic image, but in that sense. And I want to rethink about these images that I showed in the beginning of these experiments, and rethink of them as sonic images, in that sense.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much. It was a really great presentation. Yeah, we can start there. Why not? I think you add a layer to the kind of sonic image. I think for me, the definition of what is a sonic image, it's an image that behaves like sound. It's not the other way around. So we for example, a spectrograph or some kind of visualization of sound is explicitly for me not a sonic image, because it's actually a visualization of sound. I'm more interested in thinking about images which actually sonify themselves. And I think something in what you're dealing with there is really on that, these kind of bodily inscriptions of sound. But it also occurred to me that when you were talking, that it's kind of like there's this kind of gap, right, where in which the pathologization of those movements in the past as hysteric, as traumatized, potentially in that pathology, in that diagnosis, fail to see them as language. And you use nonverbal, but or extra-linguistic. Yeah. And that's interesting for me, because actually there is potentially there is something being spoken there. Yeah. And maybe if we can kind of get to what's being spoken, we can almost start to understand how those images are behaving like sounds in a way.
Exactly. This is the most interesting thing about these images, where I start thinking about them as literally sonic visualization. Literally, like sound, we can watch sound. We can literally see the effects of sound on individuals. We can actually end up metricizing as well some levels of sound on how these women were actually reacting to sound. But at the same time, even in the contemporary video, in the modern ritual that I showed now, the effects on this person in the ritual as well is directly connected to the quantification of sound. So this individual in his body was quantifying certain sound levels. He was quantifying certain effects and certain like sonic manifestations. But as well, this comes to the other kind of like part of this of things I was talking about, which is it's not strictly about sound, because it's not the sound that is making this effect, especially as well in these old images. It's not the sound that is making these women become like react this way as well. Sound has a role in it, but there's a whole sets of conditions that are like generating this environment, or what you call as well atmosphere.
Yeah, sound is the basis on which an atmosphere is kind of built, or it's the spatial foundation for the construction of an atmosphere, which also involves the things that you spoke about before. But what was I thinking about just before you went there? Something about... Anyway, it'll come back to me. But I think maybe it would be worth kind of like going through all of the sort of concepts that you bring out in your presentation. So, like, because they, at some point, you know, when you condense it, they overlay. So I think it may be worth kind of like picking them out.
Yeah.
You have this kind of tazkira, right? You have the istinzal, the zar, whatever it is, the psychosocial. I think these are really important to sort of understand before we sort of like can fully dive into what you're saying and your implications.
Yeah, the tazkira is a very important, for example, like to think about tazkira as a part of Zar ritual. So whenever the ritual happens, part of the rituals, one of the description of the ritual is called hadra. Inside this hadra, there's many protocols, let's say. But one of the protocols, as if, let's say you are seeing a doctor. It's not good to like downgrade it into like a medical term, but like to think about it in these like more simpler term. As if you're seeing a doctor, you see your doctor once, they diagnose you, and then they will tell you, we're gonna see you like in 2 weeks to see if you're getting better. We're gonna see you in more time. But in Zar, the tazkira is a practice where a subject that is possessed start to slowly familiarize themselves with the spirit that is possessing them. So they do a tazkira when they go to the ritual every time, as if you're meeting someone and you meet them again and again, you know them better and better and better. So the tazkira happens. So for example, or like another concept that I want to talk about, like psychosocial. I use psychosocial, for example, rather than like psychological, because at one point in this talk, I would mention the tensions with the psychiatric and the traditional. And the psychiatric, the way I see it, is socially constructed. It's not more reliable than a traditional practice in that sense. And it's not less a product of culture than a traditional practice. They're both, so the social, when I use the word the psychosocial, it's a mix between putting like, stressing on the socially constructed background of a psychiatric practice or a psychological practice, and it's social in the sense, it's social effect, how much it's indebted to a social context as well,
Yeah, and in one context you show, albeit kind of an older example of a kind of 1.0 version of a psychotherapy where it's where those same acts are designed to be kind of outlawed or diagnosed in order to be cured, removed from society, and the other actually kind of inserted in. But now, as we know, psychological discourse has moved to actually come closer to something like an Istinzal, in the sense that the literature now is that actually immersing people in scenarios is actually, what sound counterintuitive actually is the path to kind of curing them, right? That the understanding that trauma is the sort of unspeakable, the loss of diagnostic capacities or analytical capacities. You can't understand or discriminate between objects, between threats, right? Things like this might seem threatening to someone, right, who can no longer kind of make those those distinctions. So what's interesting now is, of course, the return to the sort of scene, the reconstruction of events around the person traumatized, the details, right? In a way, this kind of tazkira is an interesting kind of, it shows that form of psychosocial practice has existed way before the kind of return in Western psychotherapy to the sort of idea of the reenactment as therapeutic, right? To sort of like use VR or AR to actually place someone exactly back at the scene of what has potentially traumatized them, and to reconstruct it perfectly. Yeah, so I think maybe there's something interesting. I mean, you pit these two things against each other, but maybe it's also interesting to kind of bring them together somehow.
Definitely, that's interesting, and it brings us as well to this conversation of exposure. The idea of exposure and triggers, like we were mentioning earlier, is that there's this common thought or this kind of non-medical thought that exposure to a sound that is considered, between brackets, like traumatizing or traumatic, is something that shouldn't happen. But in terms of contemporary, let's say, psychiatric practice, or even in traditional practices, the exposure is important. The idea of this figure, the idea of this young man going to the ritual and willingly wanting to get exposed to loud sounds that might send him into a state that is sometimes emancipatory, or sometimes it can be really painful. But they are willingly going to this state, and sound is participating in this. So this really puts into focus this question of exposure and what sounds are allowed to be played or what sounds are not allowed to be played, or how can we actually negotiate this?
Yeah, I think that also, and I think then we should open up to the audience to say that I think you hit it really on the head in that last point, in the sense that it's emancipatory, you use the word jouissance, you use the word catharsis, but you also use the word kind of trauma and sort of violence, right? And it's all these things all at once. And I think the point is that there's a very fine line sometimes that separates them. I think a lot of people, and you and I included, somehow our early interest in sound, sound as a kind of violent force, sound as something that can, that we've both examined in its use in kind of conflict. But at this, extensively, that's where our work has led us. But potentially our first kind of experience of sound is like the jouissance around noise, right? And actually being exposed to loud noise, willingly exposing yourself. And I think some of that joy, that jouissance, is still there. That's what kind of carries some of that desire. And I think to deny that is also like increasingly harder for me to do as the kind of years go by. And I wonder if you think the same.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Especially I know exactly what you're referring to in terms of enjoyment with loudness and enjoyment of percussive sound and enjoyment of extremes of noise. And it has this kind for so many people, like not just us, but for so many people, this, or even in cultural context, this music provides a sense of security rather than a sense of threat. So it's like, this is the thin line. It's a really aggressive thin line between extreme threat and total security. It's a sense where people feel like they're coming back to what they're familiar with. They're coming back to like home, like some types of music for some people means home. We're thinking about, like, for example, in terms of Afro-Caribbean communities and loud bass music. This music can have similar properties. A bass punch or a bass kick can have similar properties to an explosion sometimes. But some people willingly decide to actually go into this. And this is emancipatory as well. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience? What if there's no people to ask theirs first? We go to Nana. Someone at the back.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. It was super interesting. I had a question to you about markets. So in this presentation, we sort of heard about Zar practices as something that is almost, the opposite of modern science, right, or psychiatry, but actually, a lot of these practices operate today based on supply and demand. It costs a lot, actually. You have to pay a lot of money to have somebody treated through these traditional practices. So I was just wondering, based on your research, if you could tell us about the modern in the traditional, meaning, how are they structured by essentially modern economies? And how are they regulated? In some places, I know that they're definitely considered outlawed. So it's actually taboo to be, to go see a sheikh and be treated this way. But in other places, it's a black market. Like it's, there, everybody knows it's there and you do it, but it's not considered illegal to do it. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about that aspect. Thank you.
That's very interesting because I was thinking a lot recently, even last year. The thing that really brought me to Zar is this famous group. I don't know, maybe you're familiar with this group called Mazahir. They're like an Egyptian Zar performance group. I'm not sure if Mazahir, for example, give a service of healing or of spirit possession or whatever, but they actually are included in the music market, very much. Meaning they have a manager, they tour, there's so much restrictions on where they can play, how do they want to play, and how much they should get paid. But this is reflective of something that this theorist I was looking at, this anthropologist, Hagar al-Hadidi, she talks about Zar ritual complex. She thinks about it as a complex the same way we think about military industrial complexes or military entertainment complexes, meaning that the complex is intertwined with so many financial infrastructures. And it functions in so many communities. The communities such as North Africans, for example, North African communities, it's totally a parallel to a medical community, to a medical institution, meaning that you see a doctor in some practices, for example, in North Africa, in areas where Gnawa music is performed, which is as well has some inspiration from Zar. So many people see a doctor and they see a Gnawa healer or a Gnawa performer as a healing in parallel. So this is we look at both practices. But the interesting thing that is being now that is developing in the last few years is that, like Lawrence was saying, there's a big return to these practices, even in psychiatric contexts. So meaning that I imagine in some time or even now, the market is totally deregulated in this and is expanding massively. And I don't think, in my opinion, in these countries, a certain religious regulation will have any power over this, because it's something, in my opinion, that surpasses religious belief in its orthodox sense. It's more related to common and kind of traditional practice rather than a just religious one, although religion is involved in it. But religion as a regulator of it, I doubt it will be able to actually contain it. Yeah.
Hello, can y'all hear me? Yeah. My question, I'm just gonna shoot the question, sorry, is more about the historical tracing that you went through during your research in terms of geography. Because you do mention, maybe I didn't pick it up earlier, but you do mention geographical causalities and all of these. And then your presentation is predominantly set up within Arabia. So I'm interested if there are spiritual practices, whether it's Zar or other alternatives that are indigenous to Arabia, because you do speak about the intersections between East Africa, and you do speak about neo-colonial effects and forced migration and the Indian Ocean slave trade. And I know all of that within how you traced it back, but I'm just interested about the imagery. Where did it specifically come from, if you know, or if you traced it back to which region within Africa these community came about, and if there are any specific to Arabia?
Yeah, so to think about the term strictly, the term Istinzal, which is the spirit possession that occurs here, that occurs in the region, let's say. Because like in Zar, which is in Egypt, and initially it started from Ethiopia, or like Abyssinia, which is like Habasha, it's slightly different from Istinzal in itself. The Istinzal is particularly here. It's particularly in this region. But it's not something that has like a very type of precise origin. It's an amalgamation. So it's an inspiration of several practices mixed with a local practice. However, the word Istinzal, this like using this reference, it comes from a very particular, I hope I'm not wrong, but this is the only thing I found. It comes from a very particular reference in a book written in the 1200s by an Algerian scholar that was based in Egypt called Ahmed al-Buni, and he wrote a book called Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra. Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra is a major esoteric occult compilation that contains like a collection of practices. And in it, there's this sentence that I was using here because it summarizes everything, which calls علم استنزال الأرواح. It's arguably translated into the science of spirit imputation, which is imputation meaning the science of attributing spirits to something or attributing a spirit to someone. And the second part is in their conjuration in the molds of ghosts. The molds of ghosts are bodies, are human bodies. So meaning that these spirits, they need a body to come and be possessed in it. Anyway, this sentence comes from this book, and this word, Istinzal, is used in this book. Another history of it means hydromancy, meaning doing magic with water. It comes from an Algerian, North African context as well. So, to be honest, I couldn't trace exactly where it's coming from here, even because certain theorists or certain writers that write about music in this region, like Aisha Belkhair, she even traces the history of Zar in the region to an East African origin. Although some other writers, they say like Saamiri on its own, this musical style is of Bedouin descent. But I still believe that there is like this practice of the spiritual practice or the idea of the spirit. It has its roots here as well.
But I think you have this last sentence in your presentation about sort of like the return somehow of this slave trade being one of the parts of this amalgamation of psychosocial kind of atmospheric production. Maybe just kind of that's something to break down that last sentence. It's very dense, but I think it had your argument contained within it.
But it's
Thing in relation to what you're asking. Yeah.
It is very important to think about that in that sense, because there has been so many exchanges, cultural, but so many are coercive. So many are coercive cultural exchanges, and so many are forced cultural exchanges. And through this practice that is happening in the region, particularly in Saamiri, by young Arab individuals that are of African origins, some of them, is a form of actually negotiating with this return to this concept. Although I'm not sure as well that these stuff are mentioned. These stuff are verbally mentioned, but in some references, in some easy references on the history of music in the region, the performance of Africanness is very present in these, is very direct in these performances, okay? But that research, for example, that I'm talking about, this reference is like 40, 50 years old. So I don't know now what does it mean in terms of like integration or in terms of like slight erasure of particular like origins, okay?
Hi. Your topic is quite interesting. What I've heard from my knowledge for a very long time, how do you differentiate this particular study with Ruqya, which has been quite a old tradition and, you know, part of healing in terms of traditional ways of healing, basically? So how do you differentiate that? I mean, between this and the oldest study? That's what I've known, but I don't know if it's really true or not.
Very hard question. Because I just, like, at one point I got interested in Ruqiyya, but I didn't, to be honest, I didn't do proper research about understanding what it means, but the sonic aspect in it is very important. But I think it's more than the sonic, it's more the words. And the Ruqiyya is this practice where someone is going through a state of distress or a certain, like, let's say, psychological distress or physical affliction or something like that. And someone comes to them and they read verses of the Quran very close to them in a very low voice, where the people only, the afflicted person can only hear it. It's very loud, it's very low, it's very calm. It's just like murmuring the words in a way. But Ruqiyya is about the words rather than about the sound itself. If you think that the words are the healing, or the words are that have the effect, the words that can have like this kind of transformative effect.
I mean, the point of Islam and Arabic is you can't make the distinction between the sound of the word and the word, because that's the idea. That it's unlike English, right, where the Bible can be translated, right, the Quran can't. So this idea then that, yeah, I think there's something interesting about also the level at which trance can be induced. It doesn't need to be this kind of loud bass. It can happen through a whisper, right? And I think each one of these create the kind of atmospheric conditions necessary, whatever they are, and they might be diverse. They might be, it might be that
I have a question, but a bit of comments. Like, have you related your research with the, like, my ancestors, like Turkish and Mongols, they had music. There was a Tenegri religion, like a religion of sky, and they had music that they produce from the throat. Yeah, so their name is shaman. Is it, can you, I don't know, but I felt it is more close to shaman. Yeah.
Definitely, it definitely can have shamanic origins, but I can't know. It's too anthropological for me to know actually these particular origins, but there's definitely an effect, a relationship.
Yeah, because it is also, there is no prophet, no holy book or something like, unlike other religions, but it is a direct relation of man, a spirit with the God.
In these practices, there is no direct relation. There is a mediator. There should be a mediator, which is a human being as well, and a spirit, or like the atmosphere and the environment and everything. So their connection with spirits or God, like spirits on one hand and God on the other hand, should happen through a mediator.
I had I guess, slightly boring question, so I apologize in advance. But I was interested in how you negotiate in your research, being specifically sonic, the kind of attentiveness you might need to the ethnographic, right? How do you kind of tread that line? Because, of course, a lot of the material that you're working with is material you've acquired not necessarily experienced or are able to experience in the way in which anthropology would demand, right? Which gives you some freedom, but then also there are these necessary gaps. How do you negotiate that?
Yeah, I mean, this is as well, it's related to how Lawrence as well works. And in the sense, in that work, the ethnographic part is not very, it's not that it's not crucial, it's not very critical, or it's not very, I don't know, it can be problematic for some people, it can be like, a practice of othering, etc. There can be all sorts of problems that we can talk about in ethnography in this. But the other one is when you're working with like conflicts, when you're working with violence as an ethnographic work. I don't know if if you call it ethnographic work, or I never called it myself an ethnographic work. But for example, working with witnesses, or working with people that are listening, or people that are living in an environment that is like somehow hostile. Um, the the idea of having an ethnographic approach to it can be very like critical, and sometimes you'd rather be on this, you'd rather take a distance instead of constantly being in it, because like there might be all sorts of issues. And the other issues, for example, that we think about is that how to access like groups, or how to access like people that are like not like in a condition that where they can actually communicate ideas, or where they can actually tell you information, or convey anything. So you have to just sit and wait until something appears.
Yeah. That's a really like vital question, right? And I think it's one that needs a bit of pausing on, but at the same time, I think it's half answered by your use of the psychosocial a little bit, right? Because it's more about, as I understood it, in pitting these two examples next to each other, it's more about psychosis in its social construction, rather than a kind of ethnographic like sort of return to drums and drumming and rhythm patterns. And do you see what I'm trying to say? Yeah. And I think that's a really key kind of like claim that would need to be made, right? Like, because it is opening up to another kind of gaze that could be that could reproduce a kind of violence that you're not interested in. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if you had trouble accessing material specifically related to the context of whether it's istinzal or istihdar or even exorcisms pertaining to women's rituals and practices, because I noticed most of them were within the male social. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Sorry. That's definitely. But even the male thing, it's not very obvious. It's you can see, you can Google, you can find like on YouTube, etc. But like to find particular stuff, for example, Shabah Bisha, he's very famous. He's really he's a pop star in this thing. He's a pop star of spirit possession, of Istinzal, of Saamiri. Like even they talk with him on popular media and like in TV. We heard that in your shows people got possessed. But for example, for women, it's much harder. Of course, in that sense, it's much harder because you cannot have public videos portraying this practice. And the thing, for example, that I was looking at in terms of like female practices of like rituals is that strictly it's inzar in the Egyptian context. Because the Egyptian context, literally it's all about the woman. Men are just in the background drumming a bit and whatever, but like the main masters of zar are women, and the main practitioners, the main, even as if it's as if like men just come as to get a service of being healed or something, but like the healer is a woman. But here, it's much harder to find it in that context because of like, because of certain, I don't know, cultural or like religious restrictions, etc. Especially that this practice is considered, it's not prohibited, but it's frowned upon. A spirit possession, it's like, it's not, I don't know why is it as well slightly tolerated even, because at one point in history it was totally frowned upon. It's not something that you should practice, specifically if you're a devout Muslim, etc. So now it's having like this place where it has like some tolerance a bit, but still within like the sphere of women to have it present in popular media or like in accessible media, it's still very hard to have access to this, no? Yeah.
So this is purely out of interest about the actual ritual that you're talking about. To what extent does technology play a part in the rituals in this day and age? And I'm just wondering if that feeds into the paranoia of being possessed, because if you think about technology today, the technology can hear us, and we're sort of being talked to by the technology once we, so.
That's hard to answer because, yeah, that's true. It's hard to answer in like 2 sentences or 3 sentences. It's like a big topic because you think about like paranoia from technology, from being overheard or hearing or overhearing yourself, and saturation with media, etc. But I think technology has a role in this musical technology. The way I'm thinking about it is that musical, okay? So I'm thinking about like amplification of sound, big sound systems, big rhythmic group, microphones, people using keyboards, electric keyboards, all sorts of like techniques. However, this existed before without any technology. And even, I'm not sure, but like it might have been more dominant and more brutal even in terms of like its effects. But technology, in that sense, will be interesting to think about the idea of being seen on a video, and the idea of being filmed, and the idea of performing, and the idea of like exaggerating the effects of a ritual because you're being filmed, because you're on a camera, etc. But however, many of the videos that I was finding were shot with an amateur camera. Nothing was like professional or nothing with phones. Sometimes no one knows that they're being filmed, etc. So I think it's more the cultural aspect, the cultural power in this is way stronger still, in my opinion. But I'm not sure about like the effects of technology in that sense, of the effect of like hearing or paranoia, which is very interesting because in the history of this, if you go to the history of like hysteria and the origins of trauma, paranoia or other sorts of manifestations, or sort of psychiatric manifestations, were actually existing, and they were actually they existed before types of technologies emerged. But some writers and some theorists would argue that they got some new disorders appeared because of technologies, and they got intensified because of particular technologies. Okay, so I think it's all about like the discourse that you are using as well to access these events or to talk about these phenomena as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm kind of intrigued by two specific things that you mentioned. One is the sonic, and the other one is the pictorial. And the whole explanation that you were talking about around the performances. I'm kind of interested in knowing about the collective consciousness, because it is not the individual who's possessed. It's kind of also as a collective consciousness. So how do you then map that consciousness through sonic vision, through sonic interventions? Like, I'm kind of curious to know about that aspect rather than the whole performative aspect of the performance itself, but as the sonic imagery of the collective consciousness.
To answer as well, look, I think of I use the reference of something called like this entangled condition, an entanglement of conditions. It's not, I don't own like, I don't own this copyright, like it's not my concept. This thinking about entanglement in a condition of listening, in the listening condition, is by this writer called Marina Peterson, that I've been really like inspired from like recently. And she thinks that, she doesn't think, this is how it is in my opinion, that when you're listening, it's not about the sound, it's not like it's not related to the sound itself, it's not related to the sonic itself, it's related to a whole set of conditions that are social, that are political, that are like technological as well, that she thinks about, through which subjectivities emerge. She borrows this concept from new materialist philosophers that think about, like, people like, just to say, like, if someone is interested, people like Donna Haraway or Karen Barad, they thought about entanglement or entanglement theory in that sense before Marina Peterson. Marina Peterson used it. And then the thing with entanglement is that you and I, we have agencies, but our agencies are not preconceived. They only emerge when we interact, or when we interact. So meaning that when you apply an effect, when you have an effect on something and I have an effect on something else, our agencies emerge. Our agencies are not like something waiting. They're not like, they're not manifesting on their own. They need an entangled situation. We need to come together so that our agencies emerge, so our capacity to act emerges. The same thing happens with sound. The same thing happens with the idea. So the idea of the collective is really important in what you're mentioning. It can be as simple as sound can have like a certain effect if it's performed within a group, like the same idea of like you going to a concert or you're going to a rave or whatever. If you go to a room alone and they put like loudspeakers and you stand, you might be interested or intrigued, but it's not an experience. The experience would be like with a large group of people dancing, etc. The same thing can be said to an experience of like a ritual or like a busy street or the experience of noise. So what you're hearing is as well heard through the other as well. So you understand sound when you look at the other, when you experience it with the other. In that sense, I think this is the only answer I can give on that, like, because it's a bit complex to think about this. Yeah.
On a somewhat related note, I'd love to hear you talk more specifically about the sound and the rhythms. Is there something about the rhythms that are a part of these activities which reflect the logic that is underlying what's happening? A four on the floor versus a two-step versus a breakbeat all have different things about them. So what can you say formally about the music in relation to these rituals in particular?
To answer this, the only concrete answer I have on this is duple meters. Like, like duple meter. It's like, for people who don't know about like music or rhythm or sound, it's like a very kind of short phrase of rhythms. Instead of playing like ta 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 ta, no, you can ta 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 ta. So it's just a rhythm, but they call it duple metered Saamiri. So in terms of Saamiri has like a collections of rhythms. Saamiri is a Saamiri rhythm, basically. It's like it's a rhythmic music, and the word Saamiri can be applied to as well the name of a rhythm. So this rhythm is called a Saamiri rhythm, or this rhythm is called Khubaiti rhythm, or this rhythm is called like etc. But for how they believe in popular culture, or within like some ethnographic works that was made on this, they say like a duple meter Saamiri can induce trance. I'm still not convinced that a rhythm would do that, but however, some scientific accounts would talk about entrainments. Okay, so this is the key kind of component, the entrainment. And in scientific practices, we can actually play a rhythm. We can put someone in a laboratory and play a rhythm repetitively for like 1 hour, and then okay, your heartbeat or like a certain you start sweating accordingly, or like you start moving or you start shaking in parallel with the rhythm, or your muscle contracts with certain rhythms. I mean, this can happen, but this can, in my opinion, this can only happen because of your relationship to vibration and resonance. Because okay, so every rhythm is resonating. It has a certain resonance. It's repeating, boom, 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 boom. Automatically, your body and your skin is gonna start resonating with it. Okay, so this is like the closest I can think about when it comes to rhythm, and I still think that the rhythm on its own, it's not like the most potent thing about this experience. You know what I mean? Yeah.
If there's no, is there any one more question? One last question? If not, then I think this is a great time to thank Mhamad, Safa, and thank everybody here at Sarkar. Thank you very much for coming. Great talk.